We are witnessing the death of trust. The fact is that never before has trust been so betrayed on so many fronts in our history. Who do we trust implicitly? Who do we question? How do we measure trust? And why does it matter? Well, one of the reasons why I think it matters is that I firmly believe that trust is what makes the world spin freely on its axis. Without trust, the whole world's out of kilter, because there are so many levels of society that require us to trust each other in order for it to work. Now, I grew up in a suburb in Sydney that might be described as indelicate. It wasn't a ghetto, but it was a bit of a rough neighbourhood. And I guess we sort of span somewhere between poor and middle class. And I'll take you to a time in 1966, which sounds like, centuries ago to most of you. But it was 1966 and I'm 13 years old and I'm walking along the street. And a car pulls up beside me. It's being driven by a 14-year-old friend of mine. And I know that he has stolen this car. And he opens the door and says, "Hop in, I'll give you a lift." And at that moment, I've got to make a choice. Do I decide to get in the car, or do I refuse the offer to go in the car, and then run the risk of losing my friendship with this person whose friendship I actually liked? I start to reason why there's no harm in this. I didn't steal the car. What would be the harm in getting a lift home in a stolen car? Why not? Maybe this was one of my important pivotal moments in life. But then I started to think about, well, how would my parents feel if they found that I'd been riding around in a stolen car? And I knew how much they'd love me and I knew how much they'd be disappointed in me. So I refused the offer of the ride, and it did begin the drift in my relationship with my friend Mick. But it didn't really matter, because by the end of that year, he'd moved away to another suburb on the other side of Sydney, and I never saw him again in my life. About 5 years later, I leave school and I get a job as a mailboy in the biggest advertising agency in the country. And over the next 30 years, I carve out a career going from mailboy to chairman and chief executive of a $1 billion advertising agency. So life turned out pretty good for me. In working in the advertising business, you spend your life building brands. And what you're doing when you're building brands is you're trying to build a relationship between a consumer and a product or service. So what you get good at is understanding how to get friendships going between human beings and inanimate objects like soap powders and toothpaste and cars and watches and telcos and all those sorts of things. So you get to understand the psyche of the consumer and what drives relationships between inanimate objects and human beings. So that then leads you on to understanding about trust between people. Trust is the lubricant that makes the world continue to spin freely on its axis, and that trust is built when confidence in someone or something is constantly realised. So that continuity of actions is what helps to build trust. And generally, an outright betrayal of trust is the death of any relationship. Now, I'm not here today to talk about something as pithy as brands and advertising. What I want to point out is that there are a lot of things that are happening in society around the world that in isolation you might not think, well, that's not that big a deal. It's not until you start to aggregate all of these things that you start to realise how trust is that we are all lowering our standards and accepting different social norms. And we're kind of we're dumbing it down. Has anybody here ever had a trust betrayed? Anybody ever been betrayed? I would think most of you. And they say that there is no stronger emotion than that of a trust betrayed. And so for those of you who have, maybe some of those words summarise how you might have felt about it at that time. But let me repeat my earlier statement. Never before in our history has trust been betrayed on so many fronts. What do I mean by that? Let's look at some fairly innocuous examples. Sports stars and politicians. When it was first pointed towards Lance Armstrong that he was a drug cheat, we, his fans, refused to believe it, because our desire for heroes was stronger than our desire for truth. And yet he was found to be guilty of being a drug cheat. In fact, somebody once said to me that it wasn't bad enough that he was taking all those drugs, he was peddling too. I mean, apparently he's told so many lies that I'm starting to doubt he ever did walk on the moon. But anyway, so our desire for heroes was more important than trust. And when we look at politicians, We see on a regular basis that politicians make a lot of promises to get voted in, and then as soon as they get into office, they go, oh my goodness, things are much worse than we thought they would be when we got here, and I'm sorry, but there's no money to support all those promises that we made. But that's not our fault, that's the other guy's fault. And we just sort of look at that and go, well, that's just politics. We kind of expect that now. But what that means is that we're lowering our standards and we are agreeing that it's okay to be lied to by a politician in order to win our vote. And it's not. Where else have we been betrayed? Where else has our moral compass been taken away from slightly away from true north? Volkswagen in 2015 were fined by the Environmental Protection Agency in the US because they had intentionally doctored their diesel and turbo engines so that when they went into the testing in the laboratories, they would register an acceptable level of emissions. But the minute they were unplugged from those testing equipments and put out there on the road, they were emitting over 40 times the allowable amount of emissions. So Volkswagen actively plotted to deceive us. Celebrity status, celebrity value is a common trait of advertisers. We'll attach a celebrity to our product because we will take some of that fame and we'll dance in that spotlight. We'll allow our products to be dancing in the spotlight of that celebrity's fame and maybe some of their integrity and their values and all of those sorts of things. But of course now we see Rolf Harris in jail for sexual abuse and Bill Cosby charged similarly. So celebrity status has been devalued. But these are people who we invited into our lounge rooms night after night and we pointed to our children to say, you should be emulating the integrity that these people have. You should be more like them. And they've let us down pretty badly. We used to get all of our news from the media, but now the term fake news has become part of the lexicon. And we're told by somebody in very high authority that the media is the enemy of the people. And you might well say, well, I get my media from social media. I get my news from social media, from my friends. But look at the way that social media has been manipulated to corrupt the democratic process. We used to say that things were as safe as a bank. You can take that all the way to the bank. There was nothing safer than a bank. That was until about 10 years ago when the GFC happened. And that uncovered a whole lot of bad characteristics and bad actions and bad values that banks were carrying forwards. And over the last decade, we've had a number of inquiries, Senate inquiries, all sorts of commissions. We're going through the Royal Commission at the moment with banks, insurance companies, superannuation and so on. And it's unpicking just this enormous suite of horrific actions where banks have been lying to us, stealing from us, deceiving us, trying to cover it up, selling us products that they never intended to deliver. They've been charging dead people for life insurance policies. So our trust in banks has been trashed. And I'm not going to go into any detail, the lack of trust that we now have in religious institutions and various community institutional groups. Shocking situations there. So you might say, well, so what? Why is this important? Well, it's important because trust is the bedrock foundation of all of our relationships with our family, with our friends, with our employers, with our community groups, with our institutions, with our country, with other nations. Trust is the bedrock of that. Without trust, we rust, and that's the fact of it. We just kind of like the gears start to gnash and the wheels of the economy and society stop operating. So when I'm looking to assess somebody's trustworthiness, I've developed a formula to see how I might calculate the level of trust that I would have in someone or something. And it works a little bit like this. I look at trust on the 4 A's: authenticity, ability, and actions, multiplied by alignment. So what I mean by that is authenticity is about, are you real? Are you genuine? Are you honest? Are you truthful? And then when I go to ability, it's really a question of, if you're going to take on this project or this responsibility, do you have the skills, knowledge, and experience to be able to deliver on that responsibility? And then I measure your actions. Are your actions in concert with those skills, and your actions and behaviours in concert with the values that you say that you exude in your authenticity? And I add those 3 together and a score out of 10 each, and then I multiply them by a potential score out of 10 for alignment. And alignment is about, is there fairness in the way that our objectives are aligned? Or is one side trying to get too big a gamesmanship out of this? So, for example, when you find out that your financial planner put you into an insurance scheme so that they could then get a brand new set of commissions which represented more than 100% of your first year of premiums, you might be saying, I'm not really sure that they're recommending this to me because it's in my best interest. They're recommending it because it's in their best interest. So alignment's really important when it comes to measuring trust. So let's take this as an example about how we might measure trust with banks. And I don't want to appear to be a bank basher, but they're just such easy prey at the moment, and it's so top of mind, we may as well go with them. If you go back 10 years ago before the GFC, I had an enormous amount of trust in banks. So on a scale of 1 to 10 on authenticity, I would have given them a 9. I would never have believed that my bank would be dishonest to me, would lie to me, would cheat from me or steal from me. I always thought that my banks were authentic. And in terms of skill, they were very good at managing the money and getting those statements out, and they never got it wrong, so I give them an 8. And in terms of their actions, they were a 7. So I add those up together and I get a score of 24. But when it comes to alignment, I always just sort of thought they were kind of like just on the other side of being more in it for them than they were in it for me 10 years ago. So I would have given them a 6. So if you've got a potential score of 300, which is 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals 30, times another 10 is 300, that comes to 144 out of 300. So that's how I felt about the banks 10 years ago. But what's happened recently, that the banks have been revealed to have been lying to us, deceiving us, cover-ups, all of this various cheating and thieving that's been going on. On authenticity, I'd take them for a 9 down to a 4. And on ability, I'd reduce them to a 6. They're still reasonably capable. But on actions, I'd take them down to a 3 because their actions have been atrocious. So that's now going to give me a score of 13. And I've got a lower alignment score because I'm sure they're not really in it with my interests at heart. They're really in it with their interests at heart. So I'll give them a 2. That then takes them down to a score of 26 out of 300. So it's going to be a long climb back for the banks. Because without trust, commerce collapses. Because trust is the bedrock that makes commerce work. You see, if I said to you, this is a $50 note, for those of you who can see it from the back of the room. So if I said to you, how much is that $50 note worth? You'd probably say $50. But it probably cost less than $1 to make it. If you look at Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, what he talks about is that money is only worth something if everybody believes in the myth that it's worth something. And so if I believe that I can exchange that $50 note for someone else in return for goods and services, and I can then take that $50 note and I can spend it with somebody else and they will honour it and the next person will honour it, then it works. But if we get to a level where trust is so decayed and so broken that people don't trust that money's worth anything, then we're all in a big trouble. How do we fix this issue? Well, I think there are a few things that we can do. And the first one is to teach some values. I think the vast majority of people are good. They start out with good intentions. But what happens is, as we continue to recalibrate our acceptance of lower standards of trust, we reduce our own standards and we accept even continuing lower standards. So what happens is that people don't start out to be an axe murderer. They just take a small step into the dark side, a little bit into the light grey. They do something a little bit wrong. And then they take another small step into the grey. And it starts to get a little bit darker grey and a little bit darker until eventually they are there in the dark side. So there is a job for parents and teachers to teach values and to teach ethics. And I know that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not ethics should be taught in schools, but from my perspective, it's a no-brainer. The next simple thing we can do is to be more respectful. I don't know about you, but it bothers me that magistrates and judges are now saying that it's okay for people to swear profusely at police when they're being arrested. They don't see that as offensive. It's not only offensive to the officer that's been doing the arresting, but it's also offensive to the badge, it's offensive to the institution, it's offensive to the rule of law. So we're accepting these things, that people are allowed to have that sort of misbehaviour. I don't know if it bothers you, but it bothers me that when I see stories about ambulance paramedics out rescuing and saving people, or nurses and doctors in emergency wards being verbally and physically abused while they're trying to save lives, I find that really difficult to accept. So we need to be much more respectful. The next thing is to reduce the temptations. I always think that if somebody is stealing from my business, and I've got such loose systems on cash controls and financial reporting that they are allowed to and probably even encouraged to steal from me, it's as much my fault as it's their fault that they're stealing from me. So get rid of the temptations. And finally, if you make a mistake, admit it. Tell people, don't try to cover it up. If you tell people I made a mistake, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's what I've done to fix it, I'm really sorry about that, they're supportive with you and they'll support you forever. But the minute you get caught trying to cover something up, they'll never trust you again. So that's the question that I always ask myself when I'm facing a moral dilemma. If I want to make a good decision on a moral issue, I'll start by saying, how would my mother feel if she read this in the newspaper? Now, I'll take you back to the Elliot Trust formula. Before I do that, let me finish my story about my friend in the stolen car. I said to you that I hadn't seen him since that day when I was maybe 13 and a half, 14 or something by the time he left. And he moved away. Until one night, 20 years later, I'm watching TV, and there in the lead item on the television news is my old mate. And there is a story about him and his two brothers and a mate who have stolen a car and embarked on a night of crime and cruelty that resulted in the death of an innocent young woman. It was one of the most heinous crimes in Australian history, and my friend then is now locked up in Supermax with his papers never to be released. So maybe that decision to get into the stolen car or not was my pivotal moment. So back to the formula, what I try to do is I try to look at my own life and relationships, and I judge what is my level of trustworthiness for this relationship with a customer, with a person, with a company, or whatever it might be. And I give myself an honest score, and I see how I can continue to improve it. And so one of the best ways that we can all improve trust in our world is to take a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror and use this sort of formula to say, how am I rating and how can I improve it? Because if we all do that, then we're all just kind of auto-correcting a little bit each day to get onto a better path for a greater level of trust and less betrayal. And if we do that, then I think we're going to have a lot happier, healthy and successful society. Thank you.